Good morning, sir, and all my friends here. We are from Section L1, Tutorial 2 for Contract Law 2. I'm the group leader, Cho Ewan. And my group members are Anu, Serene, Xuan En, and Jiawen. Today we will present a case involving the Emirates Development and Aman Bill regarding the discharge of contract and remedies under the Malaysian contract law. In this scenario, Emirates entered into a 12 million construction contract with Aman Bill, where time was of the essence. Although Emirates later granted an extension and additional payment, Aman eventually stopped work. After flooding and a governmental prohibition on construction, Emirates terminated the contract and claimed damages, while Aman argued the contract was frustrated. So the objective of these presentations are to analyze the legal issues arising from the contract dispute between Emirates and Aman under Malaysian contract law. Next, we will determine whether the contract was discharged by breach of frustration. We will also discuss the possible argument raised by both Emirates and Aman. Lastly, we will evaluate the remedies available to the parties involved based on the Contracts Act 1950 and relevant case law. Now, I will pass the floor to Anu to present the first issue.
Good day everyone, my name is Anushi. The first issue for this case is whether Aman's bill request for a 3-month extension of time and additional payment amounts to an anticipatory breach of the original contract where time was expressly stated to be of essence. According to section 56(1) of the Contracts Act 1950, it states that by the time of the essence, the contract becomes voidable at the option of the promisee if the promiser fails to perform within the specified time. Together with the case of Tan Akian and Haji Hasnan, Tan Akian failed to complete the roadworks within the agreed time and the defendant subsequently terminated the contract and appointed another contractor. The court held that the time of essence where it is expressly stated in the contract made essential through reasonable notice or impact from the nature of the contract. Next. In applying the law to the facts, Emirates may argue that the original contract expressly stated the time of the essence and required Aman to complete the project by 31st December 2024. Aman later requested an extension of time together with additional payment, which showed difficulty in meeting the original deadline. Furthermore, no formal supplementary agreement was executed to replace the original contractual terms. On the other hand, Aman may argue that the rising construction caused financial difficulty and made performance under the original terms more onerous. However, Aman did not completely refuse to perform the contract and was still willing to continue if additional time and financial assistance were granted. Emirates subsequently agreed to extend the completion date to 31st March 2025 and provided an additional 500,000 ringgit subject to reasonable progress. This may show acceptance of continued performance and may amount to a variation or waiver of the original completion date rather than an immediate breach. In conclusion, although time of the essence is in the original contract, Aman's bill request for an extension and an additional payment does not amount to an anticipatory breach because it was made before the completion deadline 31st March 2025 and Aman still intended to continue performance. Emirates' agreement to extend the completion date and provide additional payment further indicates acceptance of the variation rather than enforcement of a breach. Therefore, at this stage, there was no breach, only a negotiated extension of the contractual terms. Now I'll pass the floor to the next member.
Alright, thank you, Anu. Good day, everyone. My name is Jiawen. So the second issue is whether the Emirates Development Sdn Bhd have waived the time is of the essence clause by his conduct after September arrangement, thereby preventing Aman's failure to complete the work within the agreed time from amounting to a breach of contract. In Chifok and another and Te Teng Seng Realty Sdn Bhd, the plaintiff entered into a housing sale and purchase agreement, completion within 24 months, with time expressly of the essence. The developer failed to complete on time, and the plaintiff later gave notice to resign the contract before the completion. The court held that under Section 56 of the Contract Act 1950, where time is of the essence, failure to perform by the specific date render the contract voidable at the option of the promisee. Applying to the facts, Emirates may argue that since the contract expressly provided that time is of the essence, and the September arrangement is only as operations without a formal supplementary agreement, Aman's failure to maintain reasonable progress and complete the works within the extended timeline amounts to a fundamental breach under Section 56, entitling the Emirates to issue the 15 January 2025 notice and ultimately terminate the contract on 10 February 2025, especially when delay became serious after November 2024 and work eventually ceased. However, Aman may argue that the operative obligation should be assessed against the extended completion date of 31st March 2025, meaning rescission only arises upon breach of the revised terms or clear repudiatory conduct. Besides, in Siakimo and Kulim Rubber Plantation, the plaintiff agreed to purchase a rubber estate from the defendant with time expressly made of the essence for completion. Although the defendant granted the plaintiff an extension, the plaintiff still failed to complete on time. The court held that granting an extension does not waive the essential nature of time, but merely slips the deadline. Therefore, the defendant were entitled to terminate the contract and forfeit the deposit. Based on the facts, Emerald may argue that extensions of time to 31st March 2025 and additional payment of 500,000 ringgit did not waive the time is of essence cost as it only swept the deadline. Since Aman's progress slowed significantly after November 2025 and work ceased, Emerald can contend that Aman failed to comply with the extended timeline and contractual obligations of diligence justifying termination. However, Aman may argue that the clause may have been waived by the September arrangement, reflecting a broader variations indicating flexibility in time obligations rather than a mere indulgence. However, Emerald would rely on the case to maintain that time remains essential and Aman's failure to continue performance between the extended period entitled Emerald to terminate the contract and claim remedies. In contrast, in Gua Ban Po and Dragon Garden Private Limited, the plaintiff purchased a house with completion time, expressly made of the essence for payment. After dispute over defects, the plaintiff tendered the final installment under protest, which the defendants rejected and used as a basis to terminate the contract and forfeit part of the purchase price. The court held that, although the time was originally of the essence, the extensions allowed and continued negotiations amounted to waiver, making time at large. Since the defendant did not issue a fresh notice fixing a reasonable time for performance, the termination was invalid. The court granted the plaintiff specific performance and damages as he remained ready and willing to perform. In present facts, Aman may argue that Emerald's conduct of granting an extensions of time, agreeing to additional payment, and continued to negotiate after the delays amounted to a waiver of strict reliance on the time is of the essence clause, making time at large. Accordingly, Emerald's termination on 10 February 2025 would be invalid as no fresh notice was issued fixing a reasonable deadline after the alleged breach escalated. However, Emerald may distinguish this as Aman was not ready and willing to perform as work had slowed and ceased due to the financial difficulties. Emerald also issued a formal 14-day notice requiring Aman to resume work, which showed continued insistence on contractor performance. Unlike the case applied, Aman's inability to continue performance suggests repudiatory breach rather than mere delay. Therefore, Emerald may contend that the extension did not waive the essential nature of time and that termination was valid due to Aman's continued non-performance under the extended terms. In conclusion, Emerald is unlikely to have waived the time is of the essence clause as the September arrangement was a conditional extensions rather than a formal variations. Applying the first two cases, the extension merely swept the deadline without removing its essential nature, and Aman's delay, season of works, and financial inability to perform indicates breach, justifying termination. Although Aman may rely on Gua Ban Po to argue waiver through continued negotiations, this is weakened by its lack of readiness and willingness to perform. Thus, Emerald's termination is likely valid. Based on the analysis, Emerald should clearly specify in contract whether time is of the essence continue to apply after any extension of time and ensure proper issuance of contractor notice to avoid dispute over breach and termination. For Aman, maintaining sufficient financial capacity and project continuity is essential to avoid interruptions and ensure timely completions of contractor obligation. That's all from me. Now I'll pass the floor to the next presenter.
Thank you, Darwin. My name is Shen En. So, the third issue is whether Aman built delay, suspension, and inability to continue work constitute an anticipatory breach after the September arrangement. In Hoyster and De La Tour, the defendant hired the plaintiff as a courier for a future trip but later informed him before the commencement date that his services were no longer required. The court held that where one party clearly refuses to perform a contract before the due date, the innocent party may immediately treat the contract as repudiated and sue for anticipatory breach. Therefore, Emerald Diamonds and Juan Berhad may rely on this case to argue that Aman's conduct amounted to anticipatory repudiation before the extended completion date of 31 March 2025. Although Emerald has granted Aman an extension of time, together with an additional payment arrangement of 500,000 ringgit, Aman subsequently slowed down the construction works and eventually ceased work entirely between November 2024 and January 2025, well before the extended completion date of 31 March 2025. Aman further admitted that it was financially unable to continue the project. Such conduct may therefore indicate that Aman no longer intended or was no longer capable of performing the contract. Therefore, Emerald was entitled to treat the contract as repudiated without waiting until the final completion date. However, Aman may distinguish the present case from the case of Hoyster by arguing that there was no express statement that it would never complete the project. Aman may contend that he still intended to continue the construction if sufficient financial assistance or the additional 1 million ringgit requested has been granted. Thus, Aman may argue that its conduct merely reflected financial difficulty rather than a clear renunciation of the contract. In Rasya Munusamy and Lim Tan and San Sundaram Berhad, the producer refused to pay part of the purchaser price due to a genuine dispute regarding extra land under a housing agreement. The developer thus treated the contract as repudiated and cancelled the sale. The issue before the court was whether the producer refused to pay the disputed balance amounted to repudiation of the contract. The court held that mere disagreement, partial refusal, or a genuine dispute over contractual interpretation does not amount to repudiation unless the conduct clearly showed an intention no longer to be bound by the contract. Thus, the producer conduct did not amount to repudiation because there was no absolute refusal to perform the contract. In the present case, Ahmad may rely on this case to argue that its conduct did not amount to repudiation because there was a genuine dispute concerning the additional 1 million ringgit requested due to the increased material costs. Ahmad may argue that the financial difficulties and disagreement over variation payment should not automatically be treated as an intention to abandon the contract. Furthermore, Ahmad had already completed approximately 75% of the construction works, which may suggest that it initially intended to fulfill the contract rather than refuse performance entirely. Nevertheless, Emerald may distinguish the present case from the case of Rasya Munusamy because Ahmad's conduct went beyond a mere contractual dispute. Unlike the producer in the case of Rasya Munusamy, who continued showing willingness to perform the agreement, Ahmad completely ceased construction works and expressly admitted financial inability to continue the project. In addition, Ahmad failed to resume the work even after Emerald issued a reasonable and formal notice demanding continuation of the project within 14 days. Therefore, Ahmad's conduct strongly indicates an inability or unwillingness to continue performing the contract. In conclusion, Ahmad Build's delay, suspension of works, and admission of financial inability to continue the project likely constitute anticipatory breach. Although Ahmad may argue that there was merely a financial dispute regarding additional payment, its complete cessation of construction works and failure to resume the performance after notice strongly indicate an intention or inability to continue the contract. Therefore, Emerald was entitled to treat the contract as repudiated and terminate the contract. As a possible reform, Emerald Diamond Sdn Bhd should formalize all the contract variations through a written supplementary agreement and strengthen the project monitoring to identify the performance issues at an earlier stage. On the other hand, Ahmad Build Sdn Bhd should improve its financial risk management and contingency planning to better manage rising material costs and cash flows difficulties. These measures could have reduced the uncertainty between the parties and potentially prevented the dispute from escalating into anticipatory breach and termination of the contract. That's all from me, and now I will pass the floor to Anu. Thank you.
Moving on, the fourth issue is whether the contract between Emerald Development Sdn Bhd and Ahmad Build Sdn Bhd was discharged by frustration following the flooding on 5th February 2025 and the subsequent government prohibition order. The applicable provision is Section 57(2) of the Contracts Act 1950, which states that a contract becomes void when an event occurs after its formation that renders performance impossible or unlawful. In Taylor and Caldwell, a music hall was hired for events, but it was destroyed by fire before it could be used. Without fault of either party, the claimant sued for breach of contract. The court held that the contract was frustrated because the destruction of the subject matter made performance impossible, thereby discharging both parties from their contractual obligation. Applying Taylor and Caldwell, Ahmad may argue that the severe flooding and government prohibition order made performance impossible as the construction site was significantly affected and the work was restricted by authorities. On this basis, Ahmad may claim that the contract is frustrated and therefore void. However, Emerald may argue that unlike Taylor and Caldwell, the subject matter on the contract is not destroyed and the project is not permanently impossible to complete. The flooding and the 2-year government ban only amount to a temporary disruption rather than a total destruction or permanent impossibility. Therefore, the doctrine of frustration should not apply. Next. In Davis Contractors Limited and Farham UDC, the appellants agreed to build 78 houses within 8 months. But due to labour shortages and difficulties, the work took 22 months to complete. The appellants argued that the contract was frustrated due to the assumed availability of labour and materials. The House of Lords held that the frustration does not arise merely because of performance becomes more onerous, expensive, or time-consuming rather than originally expected. There must be a radical change in obligation, not mere hardship or delay, for the doctrine of frustration to apply. For Ahmad, it may be argued that the severe flood constituted a force majeure event or act of God that damaged part of the project. In addition, the government prohibition order made construction temporarily unlawful and impossible during the restriction period. Since such events were beyond the control of both parties and were covered under the force majeure clause, Ahmad may argue that the performance has been prevented and the contract is frustrated. However, Emerald may argue that these events does not amount to frustration frustration. Following Davis Contractors Limited and Farnham UDC, mere delay, hardship, or increased cost does not amount to frustration. The flood and the government ban only caused a temporary disruption and did not fundamentally change the contractual obligation to complete the construction. Therefore, there is no radical change in obligation and the doctrine of frustration should not apply. In conclusion, the contract between Emerald Developments Sendirian Berhad and Ahmad Mills Sendirian Berhad is not discharged by frustration, although the flooding and the 2-year government prohibition order affected performance. These events do not make the contract permanently impossible or fundamentally different. Following Davis Contractors Limited and Farnham UDC, mere hardship, delay, or increased cost does not amount to frustration, but the obligation remains the same, namely to complete the construction project. Therefore, the contract is not frustrated under Section 57(2) of Contracts Act 1950, and liability should instead be determined based on the parties' contractual obligations and conduct. So the possible legal reform for Emerald Development is the contract should strengthen the extension of time clause by clearly governing events such as the natural disaster and government regulatory bans. It should also include express provisions on risk allocation, especially for the site damages caused by flood, to clearly define responsibility and reduce disputes. For Ahmad Mills Sendirian Berhad, the contract should provide clearer protection for the contractors in case of delay caused by floods and government restriction. In addition, it should require immediate formal notice procedures when site damage or legal prohibition occurs, so that the contractors can properly preserve their contractual rights. And I'll pass the floor to the next person.
Thank you, Anu. Next, I'm Ewan. The fifth issue is whether Ahmad can claim the additional 500,000 or any further payment on Quantum Marriott. First of all, there is no issues regarding the 75% of the construction works completed before the negotiation, because the contract is a divisible contract and payment was made progressively through state payment. Once Ahmad completed the 75% of the construction works, Emirates had already paid 9 million accordingly. Therefore, there is no dispute concerning this portion of the payment. In Sumter and H, the plaintiff partially completed the construction work and abandoned the contract. The court held that the plaintiff could not claim the Quantum Marriott for the unfinished work because the defendant had no choice but to accept the partially completed structure. However, the plaintiff could recover the payment for the materials left behind as the defendant voluntarily chose to use them. Ahmad Build, as the contractor, may argue that it should be entitled to payment on a Quantum Marriott basis for the work already completed, as the employer has benefited from the partially completed construction, even though there was delay in completing the remaining 25%. Ahmad may still claim that it continued progressing slowly and had substantially performed the contract up to 75%. However, Emerald Development, as the employer, may argue that it had no choice but to accept the partially completed structure and therefore no implied obligations arises to pay for the unfinished work, except when materials are voluntarily used. The delay and incomplete performance after the agreed timeline further strengthened the Emery's position that Ahmad's claim for additional payment is weak, as the contract was not fully performed within the required terms. In Haji Hasnan and Tan Akian, the appellant subcontracted road construction work to the respondent but later terminated the contract without notice due to alleged poor workmanship and hired another party to complete the project. The respondent's request for an extension of time was refused, and he claimed payment for work done and materials supplied. The Court of Appeal held that the termination was a breach of contract, and the respondent was entitled to recover on a Quantum Marriott basis, as an implied obligations to pay for work and materials arose from the circumstances. Based on the fact, Ahmad may argue to claim Quantum Marriott for the work already completed and the material supplied. It can argue that there was an implied obligation for payment after Emirates' refusal to grant the additional 1 million requested due to the rising material costs. Although both parties agreed to an additional 500,000 during the September arrangement, no formal supplementary agreement was executed. Ahmad even tried to continue construction work but later stopped due to the financial inability to proceed. Therefore, Ahmad seeks compensation following the termination of the contract based on the value of work done. However, Emerald Development may argue that Ahmad failed to complete the work properly, and the delay followed by eventual stoppage amounts to a breach of contract. The September arrangement, although not a formally executed supplementary agreement, is still treated as a valid agreement between both parties based on their mutual consent and conduct. Therefore, unlike the case, Emerald Development is not liable to pay Quantum Marriott for the work done. Instead, he is entitled to claim the damages arising from the breach, including the cost of appointing a replacement contractor, delay losses, and loss of anticipated rental income from the commercial complex. As a conclusion, Aman may not successfully claim the additional 500,000 or any further payment on quantum merit because the relation between the relationship parties is already governed by an express contract with a fixed payment structure. The 500,000 was also conditional upon Aman maintaining reasonable progress, which was not fulfilled due to delay and stoppage of work. Furthermore, Aman's failure to continue the performance may amount to the breach of contract, and a party in breach generally cannot rely on quantum merit to claim additional payment. Since 9 million has already been paid for the completed 75% of work under the contract, allowing the further recovery would not risk double compensation. Therefore, Aman is hard to claim for additional payment. So the possible legal reforms for Emirate development include clearly defining variation payment terms, such as when additional payments like the 500,000 become payable, and setting objective criteria for reasonable progress to avoid dispute. On the other hand, Aman Build should ensure that all claims for additional payment are supported by the formal variation instruction before carrying out extra works, and maintain proper contract management to ensure progress and entitlement to payment are clearly documented. Now I will pass the floor to Serene.
Thank you, Evan. My name is Serene. Now moving on to the sixth issue, which is whether the contract between Emirate Development Sendirian Berhad and Aman Build Sendirian Berhad was actually discharged by anticipatory breach or frustration. To determine whether the contract was discharged by anticipatory breach or frustration, we first look at Section 40 of the Contract Act, which it provides that where a party refuses or disables himself from performing the contract, the other party may terminate it. In this case, Aman significantly slowed down and eventually stopped construction works. His admission of financial inability further showed an intention not to perform the contract. Emirate then issued a 14-day notice requiring Aman to resume work, but Aman failed to comply. Therefore, Aman's conduct amounted to anticipatory breach, giving Emirate the right to terminate the contract under Section 40. Besides, we can look into the case of Frost and Knight, which shows that anticipatory breach occurs before the time for performance is due when one party shows an intention not to perform their contractual obligations. In other words, the breach arises in advance where a party either expressly refuses to perform the contract or acts in a way that makes performance impossible. To apply the situations above, although Aman didn't expressly state, "I refuse to complete the project," its conduct together with its admission of financial inability, it clearly shows that actually it was unable and unwilling to continue performing the contract. This demonstrates an intention not to be bound by its obligations before the agreed date, which is amounting to anticipatory breach. However, under Section 57(2) of the Contract Act, a contract is frustrated when a supervening event not caused by either party makes performance impossible or unlawful. However, in this case, the flooding and government construction ban occurred only after Aman had already stopped work and failed to perform its obligations. Since the alleged frustrating events arose after Aman's prior breach, Section 57(2) doesn't apply and Aman cannot rely on frustration to avoid his liability. It can be read with the case of Davis Contractors Limited and Farham UDC, where the court held that frustration doesn't arise merely because performance becomes more difficult, delayed, or expensive. In this situation, the flooding and the 2-year government prohibition order do not render the contract permanently impossible. The obligation still remains the same, which is to complete the construction work. Furthermore, Aman had already stopped performing before these events occur, so the doctrine of frustration cannot be applied. Next, the principle of time is of the essence applied because the contract expressly required completion by 31st December 2024 and stated that time was essential. Although Emirate granted an extension until 31st March 2025, but there was still no waiver of this requirement. Emirate also issued a formal notice on 15 January 2025 requiring Aman to resume work within 14 days. However, Aman failed to comply and slowed down the project and eventually stopped work completely. This conduct amounts to anticipatory breach and later actual breach of contract. Therefore, Emirate was entitled to terminate the contract and Aman cannot claim quantum merit because the contract was divisible and he had already been paid 9 million for the completed stages. Next, in relation to anticipatory breach, Aman stated that he was financially unable to continue the project and failed to resume work after receiving Emirate's notice. Although Aman argued that additional payment was needed due to rising costs, Emirate had already agreed to pay an additional 500,000 subject to reasonable progress. Despite this, Aman significantly slowed down and eventually stopped work altogether. After Emirate issued a 14-day notice on 15 January 2025, Aman still failed to resume construction. Under Section 40 of Contract Act, a party who refuses or disables itself from performing the contract commits repudiation. Therefore, Aman's conduct amounts to anticipatory breach. Next, Aman may argue that the contract was discharged by frustration due to the flooding and the 2-year government construction ban. However, frustration doesn't apply because this event only caused delay and temporary suspension, not permanently impossibility. Mere delay or increased difficulty is insufficient to frustrate a contract. Although a permanent prohibition on construction could potentially amount to frustration under Section 57 sub 2 of Contract Acts, Aman had already slowed down and stopped work before those events occurred. Therefore, Aman had already committed anticipatory breach and the contract was discharged by breach rather than frustration. In conclusion, frustration doesn't apply in this case. Aman had already slowed down and stopped construction before the flooding and government ban occurred. Despite Emirates' formal notice, Aman failed to resume work, which demonstrates as an intention not to perform the contract and amounts to anticipatory repudiation. Therefore, the contract was discharged by breach rather than frustration, and Emirates is entitled to terminate the contract and claim damages. The possible legal reform for Emirate Development Sdn Bhd is the contract should include clear guidelines on anticipatory breach, require a mandatory clear notice before termination, and clarify the legal relationship between force majeure and frustration to avoid uncertainty in dispute resolution. On the other hand, for Aman Build Sdn Bhd, it is important to ensure proper cash flow and financial risk planning before entering a long-term construction contracts. In addition, a contract should include clearer extension of time and suspension rights for delays and disruptions, as well as a requirement for written confirmation of any variation or concession to avoid misunderstanding. That's all for my part. Now I will move the floor to Ewan. Thank you.
Thank you, Zareen. Since the contract was discharged due to Aman's breach through delay and eventual cessation of work, despite a reasonable notice being given, Emirate may seek legal remedies such as rescission of the contract, restitution, or even a claim for damages or compensation for losses suffered. According to Section 56 sub 1 of CA, it states that when time is of the essence in a contract, failure to perform within a specific time makes the contract voidable at the options of the innocent party for the unperformed part. When time is expressly made of the essence in a contract between Emirate Development and Aman Build, Aman's delay and cessation of work before the stipulated deadline of 31 March 2025 amount to an anticipatory repudiation. This entitles Emirate as the innocent party to treat the contract as voidable for the unperformed portion and to terminate the contract, as well as pursue remedies for delay and non-performance. Also, according to Section 74 sub 1 of CA, it states that when a contract is breached, the innocent party is entitled to claim compensation for any loss or damage caused by the breach. This includes losses that naturally arise in the usual course of things, or losses that the parties knew were likely to result at the time of the contract was made. However, compensation is not awarded for any remote or indirect loss or damage arising from the breach under Section 74 sub 2. Therefore, Emirate Development may claim compensation for losses caused by Aman Build breach under Section 74 sub 1. This includes losses that naturally arise from the breach in the usual course of things, such as additional completion costs, delay losses, and loss of anticipated rental income, provided they were foreseeable at the time of the contract was made. However, Emirate cannot recover any remote or indirect losses that do not naturally arise from the breach. On the other hand, Section 76 of CA states that a person who rightly resigned a contract is entitled to compensation for any damage which he was sustained through the non-fulfillment of the contract. If Emirate Development lawfully resigned the contract due to Aman Build breach, Emirate is entitled to claim compensation for any damage suffered as a result of the non-fulfillment of the contract, including costs incurred and losses arising from Aman's failure to complete the construction. Section 65 of CA states that when a voidable contract is rescinded, the other party is no longer required to perform their promises. The party residing must also return any benefit received under the contract as far as possible to the other party. If Emirate Development resigned the contract due to Aman Build breach, both parties are discharged from any further obligations under the contract. Aman is no longer required to continue performing the construction work. However, the benefit received under the contract must be restored, so that both parties are returned to their original position before the contract was made. As a conclusion, for the time is of the essence clause, Aman's Build request for negotiation in September 2024 did not amount to a breach of the original contract, even though time was expressly stated to be of the essence because Emirates agreed to the September arrangement. However, Emirates agreement did not mean that it waived the time is of the essence clause by conduct, as the extension was only an additional arrangement to the original contract. Emirates later issued a formal notice requiring Amanbuild to perform within 14 days, showing that the clause was still enforced. In the issue of anticipatory breach, Amanbuild's continuous delay and eventual cessation of work show a failure to complete the project within the agreed time. This conduct demonstrated an intention to no longer perform the contract, which amounts to an anticipatory breach of contract. While for the frustration issue, the contract was not discharged by frustration because the flood and government ban were only temporary events. Performance of the contract was still possible after 2 years if the land becomes suitable for construction following review. Therefore, the contract was not impossible to perform permanently. So, since the contract was discharged due to Amanbuild anticipatory breach rather than frustration, Amanbuild cannot claim quantum merit. Furthermore, Emirates had already paid 9 million for the 75% of work completed. As 25% of the work remained unfinished, Amanbuild is not entitled to any further payment. All in all, Emirates may resign the contract on the grounds of Amanbuild failure to perform an anticipatory breach of contract. Emirates may also claim compensation or damages for losses suffered, including the restoration where appropriate. That's all from us. Thank you.